Caitlin Clark just told the world her own coach benched her against her will, and days later, the Indiana Fever were sitting in a closed-door meeting nobody in that building wanted the media to find out about. By the time this video ends, you're going to hear the quote Kelsey Mitchell gave reporters that sounded like a warning shot aimed at her own franchise. You're going to hear exactly what happened in that viral sideline blow-up between Stephanie White and Caitlin Clark. And you're going to hear the moment Sophie Cunningham finally broke her silence and told the world what was really going on inside that locker room. Stick around, because the last quote in this video is not the one you're expecting. Before we get into it, hit subscribe and turn the notification bell on, because this story is still moving. New quotes are dropping every few days, and we are going to be the first channel to break it down every single time something changes. An 8-point lead that vanished in 3 minutes. It happened on May 30th in Portland, and if you only watched the final score, you would have no idea how this game actually started. The Indiana Fever came out of the gate looking like a completely different team. Caitlin Clark was locked in, distributing the ball, reading the defense, and within the first 2 minutes, she already had 3 assists. Aliyah Boston was scoring off those feeds. The Fever jumped out to an 8-2 lead, and for a few minutes it looked like Indiana was about to run away with it. Then, at the 6:30 mark of the first quarter, with Indiana still up 8-4 and building momentum, head coach Stephanie White made a decision that would define the entire night. She subbed out Caitlin Clark. Not just Clark, Aliyah Boston and Lexi Hull came off the floor with her, all at the same time, all while the Fever were still winning. Watch what happens next, because this single substitution is the domino that knocked over everything else you're about to hear about. The moment Clark left the floor, Portland exploded. The Fire ripped off a 13-2 run in just a few minutes. By the time Clark and Boston checked back in with 3:38 left in the first quarter, the lead was gone and the Fever were already chasing the game. It never got better from there. Indiana lost 100-84, and Clark finished with just 6 points on 1 of 7 shooting, the worst scoring output of her 3-year WNBA career at that point. That's been our typical substitution pattern. After the game, reporters wanted to know why White pulled her 3 best players at the exact moment the offense was clicking. Her answer didn't calm anybody down. According to a post-game exchange first reported by Indy Star's Chloe Peterson, White explained it like this. Aliyah Boston is still working under a minute's restriction, so she comes out around a fixed point in the quarter, and Clark typically comes out at the same time. White pointed out that Indiana didn't follow that same pattern a few days earlier against Golden State because, in her words, the staff didn't want backup guard Raven Johnson out there without another ball handler on the floor. But against Portland, she said, that's been our typical substitution pattern. That explanation is basketball logic. Managing a returning player's minutes, staggering your rotations, protecting a young guard, all of that is real coaching. But it didn't land, because the optics were brutal. Indiana was winning. Then their franchise player was pulled on a clock, not on the flow of the game, and the team fell apart in the exact window she was on the bench. The sideline moment. Everyone is still talking about. Then came the clip that turned a rough loss into a full-blown national story. During a timeout in that same Portland game, sideline video captured Stephanie White seated and visibly animated, talking directly at Caitlin Clark. The footage shows Clark seated on the bench, appearing to snap back and throw both hands up in frustration. Moments later, White is seen telling another player to take Clark's seat in the huddle, effectively pulling her out of the group conversation. That clip alone would have been enough to set social media on fire. But it's what happened after the camera stopped rolling that actually mattered, and we're getting to that. The video spread everywhere within hours. Fever fans flooded social media with theories. One widely shared post accused White of killing Caitlin Clark's confidence and swagger. Another fan wrote, "This is pure coaching incompetence. Stephanie White needs to be fired." To be clear, multiple reporters who reviewed the footage were careful to point out there was no actual evidence that White was deliberately trying to undermine Clark. That theory came from the internet, not from anything confirmed. But once a moment like that goes viral, the truth of what happened matters less than the story people decide to believe. The meeting nobody was supposed to know about. 3 days after that loss, on June 2nd, the Indiana Fever held what multiple players described as a long, difficult team meeting. It wasn't originally supposed to be public. Sophie Cunningham mentioned it to reporters almost in passing, saying, "We had a long meeting yesterday. It was a really good meeting, and hopefully we've kind of turned the page, and everyone is on the same page now." When asked what was actually discussed, Cunningham said the team talked through where everyone stood, their offensive identity, where things were breaking down defensively, and what the team's culture actually looked like versus what it was supposed to look like. Here's the part that made this bigger than a normal film session meeting. When Kelsey Mitchell was asked about it by reporters, her first reaction was to ask how they even knew a meeting had happened. When she found out Cunningham had already talked about it, she laughed, and then she said something that a lot of people took as far more than a throwaway line. This next quote is the one you need to hear in full because depending on how you read it, it either means everything is fine or it means the exact opposite. "I think it's a part of being a family," Mitchell told reporters. "If you think everything is glitz and glamour, then you're mistaken." She went further when asked whether the meeting was productive. "I think our culture is being tested to figure out if we're actually truly intentional about who we say we were going to be. Only time will tell. I think I took away from it just having a little bit more grace. You get battle tested to figure out where you truly are. And I think that's the takeaway, to really recognize and be honest about where our group is and being authentic about that, and then making the changes necessary to be great. That is not the language of a team that is completely fine. Culture being tested, battle tested, being honest about where our group is. Those are the words veteran players use when something inside the locker room has genuinely cracked and they're trying to describe it without blowing the whole thing up in public." Sophie Cunningham finally breaks it down. A few days later, Sophie Cunningham addressed the entire situation directly on her own podcast, Show Me Something. And her answer was more complicated than a simple, "Everything's fine," or "Everything's broken." "I don't even know if there was any inside scoop," Cunningham said. "I think that Steph and CC are just two very competitive people who both want to win, and sometimes you bump heads, but it was all out of good intent of wanting the same thing." She continued, "I'm not condoning her actions. I think there's room to grow in how you respond to things. But Caitlin would say the same thing, and her and Steph are fine. That's their relationship." Later that night, or the next morning, they hugged it out and talked about it. Sit with that phrase for a second. "I'm not condoning her actions." That's Clark's own teammate saying, on the record, that she didn't fully agree with how her coach handled it. That's not nothing. Cunningham also pushed back on the idea that the whole thing was a full-blown feud. "I think the media loves to create division when there's not always division," she said. "When you are in high competitive situations, pretty much 4 days out of the week, stuff is going to happen." According to multiple reports, Clark and White both later confirmed to reporters that they had moved past the moment, with Clark saying White has her back more than almost anybody on that staff. So here's where things actually stand on that first incident. It was real, it was tense, it went further than a normal coaching disagreement, and it required an internal team meeting to work through. But by Cunningham's own account and by Clark's own account, it was resolved directly between the two of them, not a full organizational collapse, no matter how the online conspiracy theories tried to frame it. Then, it happened again. If that were the end of the story, this would just be one rough week in a long season. But it wasn't the end. Weeks later, after Clark missed a multi-week stretch with a back injury, she returned to the lineup against the Los Angeles Sparks, and the exact same rotation controversy resurfaced, almost beat for beat. This time, instead of one dramatic substitution, the Fever staff brought Clark back in a series of short, choppy stints. Look at the actual pattern from that game. 3 minutes and 15 seconds to open the first quarter, then out. Back in for 2 minutes and 22 seconds, then out. 1 minute and 29 seconds in the second quarter, 3 minutes and 5 seconds. 2 minutes and 18 seconds in the third, 3 minutes and 10 seconds to close it out. Her longest single stretch on the floor the entire night was 3 minutes and 15 seconds. Keep that pattern in your head, because what Clark said about it afterward is even more revealing than the minutes themselves. Clark finished that game with 9 points, 4 rebounds, 3 assists, and 4 turnovers on 4 of 12 shooting, in a loss to a Sparks team that had lost its previous 3 games by a combined 70 points. And afterward, she didn't hide how she felt about the plan. "It's really hard when you're playing 3 minutes, sub out 3 minutes, 3 minutes, then you're on the bench," Clark said. "It's really hard to get into the flow." She was even more direct when asked whose idea the rotation was. "That was not my decision," Clark said. "That wasn't on me." 2 completely different stories about the same night. Here's where it gets genuinely strange. While Clark was telling reporters this rotation wasn't her call and that it was destroying her rhythm, Stephanie White was in the same press room offering a very different explanation, one built entirely around physical conditioning. "Anytime you've missed a couple of weeks, it's going to take time to get acclimated," White said. "It's going to take time to build endurance. It's just a tough scenario when you're on a minutes restriction and you're trying to get back into rhythm throughout the course of the season." The problem is, Clark had already addressed the endurance question herself, and she said the opposite of what White's explanation implied. "Overall, my body feels great," Clark told reporters. "So that's the positive I can take from today." One person in that press room is describing a fragile player who needs to slowly rebuild stamina. The other person is describing a player who feels physically fine and just wants the chance to play through a rough stretch instead of being pulled every 3 minutes. That's not a huge scandal on its own. But layer it on top of everything that happened back in May, and you start to see a pattern that has now repeated itself twice in the same season. How we got here. The back injury. Nobody fully explained. To understand why fans reacted so strongly to that second rotation controversy, you have to understand what Clark had already been through before she ever stepped back on the floor against the Sparks. Her back issue wasn't a one-day tweak. It cost her a multi-week stretch of the season entirely, and it came on top of a run of soft tissue injuries that had already limited her workload going back to the previous year. When a player with that injury history finally returns, every team in professional sports faces the same balancing act. Bring her back too fast and risk a setback. Hold her back too cautiously, and you get exactly the kind of choppy, rhythm-killing rotation Clark ended up playing under. That context matters, because it's the difference between a coaching staff being genuinely careless with their star player and a coaching staff making a defensible, if unpopular, medical decision. Nothing in the reporting suggests White ignored medical guidance, but it also doesn't erase the fact that Clark, the person actually living through those 3-minute stints, said flatly that the plan wasn't hers and that it made it nearly impossible to find any rhythm on the floor. Both things can be true at once, and that's exactly what makes this story more complicated than a simple hero and villain framing. The pattern fans keep pointing. Once you line up both incidents side by side, it's easy to see why Fever fans keep bringing up the same complaint every time this happens. In the May 30th Portland game, the issue was White pulling Clark at a fixed point in the rotation, regardless of how the game was actually flowing. Indiana was up 8-4 and building momentum, and she came out anyway because that's been our typical substitution pattern. In the Sparks game weeks later, the issue was almost identical in spirit, a predetermined clock-based plan that didn't bend to what was actually happening on the floor, this time justified by endurance building instead of a standard rotation. Notice the common thread in both explanations. It's never described as a real-time basketball decision. It's described as a pattern, a plan, a protocol that existed before the game even started. That's the exact detail that keeps fueling the online theories, even the ones that go too far. Fans aren't just reacting to Clark sitting on the bench. They're reacting to a coaching staff that, twice now, has publicly defended a decision by pointing to a preset plan rather than to what was unfolding in front of them, in a season where their franchise player has already lost significant time to injury and desperately needs continuity to get back to form. What's actually at stake here? It's worth stepping back and asking why a rotation disagreement in a single regular season game is generating this much attention in the first place. The answer is simple. Caitlin Clark isn't just a player on this roster. She's the single biggest commercial driver the WNBA has ever had. Attendance, merchandise sales, and television ratings for Fever games have consistently outpaced the rest of the league since she arrived, and every network and sponsor connected to this team is watching how she's used on the floor as closely as fans are. That's exactly why a story like this doesn't stay contained to one locker room. When the league's most watched player says publicly on camera that a coaching decision was not my decision and that it made it really, really hard to find her rhythm, that statement travels a lot further than a normal athlete's post-game frustration would. It becomes a referendum on how the organization is handling its most valuable asset, and it puts real pressure on a coaching staff that has to balance player health, team chemistry, and the expectations of an entire league that's counting on this partnership working. And this isn't the first time this season the Fever have had to manage outside noise around Clark. It's worth understanding just how much scrutiny follows this specific roster compared to almost any other team in the league. Every substitution Stephanie White makes with Clark on the floor gets dissected online within minutes. Every sideline conversation gets frame-by-framed for body language. Every quiet post-game comment from a teammate gets read as either an endorsement or a snub. That level of scrutiny didn't exist around this franchise before Clark arrived, and it isn't going away. It means that decisions which would be routine on almost any other roster, a minutes restriction, a standard rotation, a coach raising her voice during a timeout, get treated as potential evidence of a much bigger story. Sometimes that scrutiny catches something real, like a genuine miscommunication between a coach and her star player. Sometimes it manufactures a controversy out of nothing more than one bad shooting night. Both have happened to this team in the same season. Where things stand right now. So let's put the whole picture together honestly, because the real version of this story is dramatic enough without anyone needing to invent anything. In late May, Stephanie White subbed Clark out at a pattern-based point in a game Indiana was winning. The team collapsed without her, and a heated sideline exchange between the two went viral. That forced an internal team meeting where Kelsey Mitchell described the team's culture as being tested, and Sophie Cunningham admitted on her own podcast that she wasn't fully condoning how her coach handled the moment. Weeks later, almost the identical conflict resurfaced around Clark's return from a back injury, this time with Clark directly contradicting her coach's public explanation for the substitution pattern. And this is the part nobody in that organization has said out loud yet, but it's the question hanging over every single one of these quotes. Clark and White have both said, on the record, that they've moved past the May incident. Cunningham says the same thing. But this is now the second time in one season that fans have watched almost the exact same sequence play out. A rotation decision that frustrates Clark, a public explanation from the coaching staff that doesn't fully match what Clark says about her own body and rhythm, and a wave of outside pressure that forces the organization to address it again. Two competitive people bumping heads once is normal. Twice, with the same root cause both times, is a pattern the Fever front office cannot keep managing quietly forever. The real question going into the rest of this season isn't whether Caitlin Clark and Stephanie White like each other. By every account, including Clark's own, they do. The real question is whether Indiana can actually build a rotation system that keeps its franchise player healthy without repeatedly putting her in a position where she has to publicly say a decision was not my decision. Because if this exact scenario happens a third time, it stops being a misunderstanding, and it starts being a structural problem the Fever can't hug their way out of. We'll be tracking every update on this the moment it happens. The next game, the next press conference, the next time Clark or White or Cunningham says a word about this on the record. If you don't want to miss it, make sure you're subscribed and notifications are on, because this is far from over.